Hello, Houston. We've made it. Program number 40. We're going to finish up discussing attitudes, look at how we go about perceiving one another, and then have a concluding activity of one sort or another if we can figure out what to do. Today what we're going to do is talk about theories of attitude formation and what the world has to say about attitudes. And in essence, they're relatively unsophisticated as efforts, but they do we do have a number of things to say. One of the oldest goes back into the 1950s, actually, and it's called balance theory, originally developed by Fritz Heider. And in essence, what balance theory argues, and you'll see the simplicity here, is basically that when we look at anything like, for instance, a husband and wife and their views of war, what you need to have is a positive balance in the multiplication that's implied here. And in this case, you've got a happy relationship. That is, husband loves wife, wife loves husband, and they both have negative views about the war. That's not a problem. Where a problem would show up in this relatively unsophisticated analysis is the following kind of a situation. Husband loves wife, wife loves husband, and each of them has a different view about how to go about reacting to the youngster when screaming. The husband is saying, don't react when she's crying because you'll reinforce crying. The wife is saying, no, you need to handle the problem when it exists so that she'll stop crying. And in that case, they've got a different view about how to go about handling the situation, and that leads to a negative balance, which means that there's going to have to be some readjustment on the part of one or the other. Probably the easiest just for one grow to hate the other, and then everything balances up again. No reaction. Okay. We move on to congruity. Another theory, very different kind of approach here. Now what you're using is a measurement technique called the semantic differential, originally developed by Osgood, Susi, and Tannenbaum back in the 1950s. Very interesting measuring device for detecting nuances of meaning. If you take a word like clothes, relatively neutral, you can rate it on 20, 25, 30 different scales, tapping into its evaluation, its potency, its activity, and so forth. A sample scale would be something like rating clothes on a good-bad scale. And the average rating for clothes is down in the 1 range somewhere. Clothes are good, generally. Take a concept like dirty, and that tends to be a very bad concept. So the rating there is usually 6.5 or 7, somewhere up at that end of the scale. Interestingly, if you put the two together and rate dirty clothes, you end up with a rating somewhere near the middle. And I guess what's involved there is, well, yeah, it's good to have clothes, but it's not so good if they're dirty. So you can measure, you can trace, you can stack concepts together and then see what the net rating is, and in some cases do a pretty good job of predicting where attitudes will end up. There are, however, some kind of hidden agendas in here. For instance, if we had, instead of rating clothes, we had rated nurse, dirty nurse ends up going off the right end of the scale, because dirty and nurse are just not two concepts we tend to think of being as associated with one another. So in this case, you have to be sensitive to what the meaning of what you're actually measuring. But it can be a very sensitive measure of kind of subtle nuances of meaning, as an emotion attached to any of a variety of different attitudes. It's been even suggested that it could be used in cognitive, international relations and so forth. It's a measure of how close people are or are not in an international debate. Another measure, which has actually generated quite a bit of interesting data down through the years, is the study of what's known as cognitive dissonance, originally proposed by Leon Festinger. In essence, we're dealing with two different things here. One is cognitions, which is essentially knowledge or beliefs, opinions about particular topics. An attitude, for instance, is a cognition, as defined by this theory. The other thing, however, is dissonance. Dissonance may occur if you believe one thing and all of a sudden find yourself acting in a different way. And the theory that actually tested this is a classic experiment. In essence, dissonance is an aversive state that has drive-like characteristics to it. That is, if you find yourself acting one way but believing something else, you put yourself into a dissonant state, and something's got to give, basically. You're either going to have to change your behavior or change your attitudes, or both, one way or the other. The classic experiment that Festinger and Carl Smith put together here involved the following kind of a situation. You were invited into the laboratory and seated in front of a desk, and did a consummately boring task. That is, for an hour, you would pick up a 1-inch square peg that was 2 inches tall and center it on a kind of a checkerboard of squares. That is, they had painted little squares onto the desktop, and all you had to do was pick up a peg, center it on the square, making sure that the peg itself covered the pattern that was on the desk. And you did a row, you did another row, you did all 10 rows. Then the researcher simply reached down with his arm, swept them across into the container, put the container back in front of you and said, do it again. No thank you, no acknowledgement of how well you've done, or nothing. For an hour, you are sitting there telling yourself, what a boring piece of this is. At the end of that hour, you are then put into a second activity where you're now sorting things like little pastel slips of paper, pink, green, blue, and whatever's another obvious color. For an hour, you're given this jumble of paper, and you're supposed to separate them out: blue stack, yellow stack, green stack, pink stack, for an hour. At the end of 2 hours, the researcher comes in and says, thank you for participating. You have been in the low motivation condition of a study sponsored by the Department of Defense. In essence, what we're trying to do is to study the impact of motivation on worker performance. Unfortunately for you, you were in the low motivation condition, and I apologize for that. It was just the luck of the draw. But I've got a problem. The researcher who normally helps me with the high motivation condition is not going to be able to be here today, but I have another subject scheduled for 2 hours, and I really don't want to waste his time or lose the opportunity to conduct the research. Would you mind reading a script which has already been written that describes the impact that this research is having on the national defense effort, and basically build up the importance of this study for this high motivation subject? Again, as I said, you were in the low motivation condition. We've got a moderate condition. This subject is randomly assigned to the high motivation condition. For your troubles, said the researcher, we will pay you $1. Or, for your troubles, we will pay you $20. But remember, this was a study done back in the 1950s, so what we're really talking about in terms of modern cost of living is somewhere between $60 and $100 for the top pay. So you're being offered a sizable chunk of change to do this. Now, when they agree, and the vast majority did, you find yourself sitting there reading to a fellow student a thing which talks about how valuable this research is after you've sat in the same place for 2 hours telling yourself what a piece of crap it is. What Festinger has done is very successfully put you into a dissonant state. You believe one thing, you're saying something very different. That's dissonance. After the research, after you've done the reading for the next subject, as you're about to head out the door, the researcher kind of slaps his head and says, oh, by the way, there was one other scale I meant to have you do. We needed to have you also fill out an assessment of the value of the research as a whole. And so you have to check off 3 or 4 things involving, among others, your attitudes toward the value of the research itself. Dissonance requires that you change an attitude. I mean, if you've got an attitude that thinks one thing and now all of a sudden you find yourself saying or behaving as if you believe something else, you're in a dissonant state. And the only way to resolve that, since you can't take back what you've told the subject, is you have to change your attitude. Whose attitude changed more, the $1 or the $20 subject? Whose attitude changed more on the post-experiment ratings? How many would say 20? How many would say 1? 1 wins. For a large fee, you don't have to justify anything. You're being paid a fee for a service performed, period. You can still believe what you believe and be perfectly comfortable accepting money because you're just helping the researcher. But for $1, you can't be had. We can't be bought for $1. Even $5 in modern times, you can't be bought for that. The only resolution there is you're in a dissonant state and you have to change your opinion. And the result is the people who were paid the lower amount showed the higher amount of change in cognitive dissonance. A fascinating study, but right on target in terms of the impact of dissonance on attitudes and attitude formation. So even if you're paid little bucks, your attitude is still going to have to change. It takes big bucks for us to be able to be comfortable with what we're doing. Now, let's look at the issue of interaction. I want to go back and remind you of a study that I did way back at the beginning in terms of how we interact with each other and, more importantly, how we perceive one another as individuals. You will remember that I talked way back at the beginning of this semester about a study that involved giving people grocery lists in a grocery store and asking customers coming out of the store to rate what would be the nature of the personality of someone who would go into a grocery store with a list like this. And the only item that differed, if you remember, this was a study of instant coffee and why it wasn't selling. And in essence, people were asked to rate somebody who would go into the grocery store with a list like this, with a Maxwell House coffee list and so forth, as opposed to a list that had Nescafe Instant on it. And if you notice, the only item that shifted here is the number 5 item. That's the only difference. And it turns out people were quite willing to actually sit there and expand on what somebody would be like who went into the store with this kind of a grocery list, based on remarkably minimal information. That would suggest that there must be some adaptive value to being able to make judgments about people based on very little information, and I could see where that might well be the case, simply because 500 years ago, if you didn't judge somebody well, you're dead. And so in essence, we had to be very good at taking very little snippets of information and being able to read people relatively accurately. And so the study of instant coffee actually capitalized on that many, many years later. Now, when we look at the issue of person perception, there are a couple of different things that go on here. One of which involves the minimalness of the information that we utilize, if I can talk about it that way. Another has to do with rated friendliness, and I want to pose a problem for you here. How would you rate Jim, friendly or unfriendly, when I tell you the following about him? Jim, I'm going to just read you a scenario of some of the activities of Jim, and I'd like you to tell me how you would react to him. Jim left the house to get some stationery. He walked out into the sun-filled street with 2 of his friends. Basking in the sun as he walked, Jim entered the stationery store, which was full of people. Jim talked with an acquaintance while he waited to catch the clerk's eye. On his way out, he stopped to chat with a school friend who was just coming into the store. Leaving the store, he walked towards school. On his way, he met the woman to whom he had been introduced the night before. They talked for a short while, and then Jim left for school. After school, Jim left the classroom alone. Leaving the school, he started on his long walk home. The street was brilliantly filled with sunshine. Jim walked down the street on the shady side. Coming down the street toward him, he saw the beautiful woman whom he had met on the previous evening. Jim crossed the street and entered a candy store. The store was crowded with students, and he noticed a few familiar faces. Jim waited quietly until he caught the counterman's eye and then gave his order. Taking his drink, he sat down at a side table. When he had finished his drink, he went home. How would you rate Jim under those conditions? Okay. Turns out we've sandbagged you here, because what we've done is to give you 2 paragraphs of information, and if you listen carefully, there's actually a point at which the information shifts from friendly to unfriendly. Everything in the first paragraph that I read you is entirely positive stuff. The street is sun-filled, he's interacting with people constantly. In the second half, it's sunny, he's walking in the shade, he's walking alone, he waits quietly, and so forth. In essence, when people hear only the friendly paragraph, 95% of them rate Jim as friendly. When they hear only the unfriendly paragraph, that is the one that started with after school, Jim left the classroom alone. He started the long walk home, and so forth. Then, only 3% of the people rate Jim friendly. What's particularly interesting are these middle 2 groups, because in essence, they have both heard exactly the same information. One of them heard the friendly paragraph and then the unfriendly. The other heard it in the reverse order. Look at the difference it makes on rated friendliness. The group that heard the friendly paragraph first, 78% of the time rates him as friendly. But if they heard the unfriendly paragraph first, identical information, only 18% rate him as friendly. There's something going on there. And in essence, what that's referred to as is the primacy effect. Okay? The primacy effect has to do with the fact that it's the tendency for us to overvalue first heard information or first learned information. That in essence what we tend to do is to overvalue the first things we hear, and oftentimes we'll even go so far as to interpret later information in terms of the first information. That's what's called the primacy effect. The contrast to that is the recency effect. There are 2 ways to create that here. The easiest way is simply to interrupt halfway through. In other words, if at the end of the first paragraph, when I'd said they talked for a short while and then Jim left for school, if at that point I had stopped and reminded you to pay attention to the remaining information before you actually reach a conclusion about Jim, anything like that is enough instead to lead to what's called the recency effect. And the recency effect is also a bias. In essence, what happens is that we now overweight or overvalue the last heard, the most recently heard information. And in essence, both of those can operate under particular circumstances. In some cases, it's the primacy effect. In other cases, it's the recency effect. When the two paragraphs are stacked together, so you get one and then the other right away, the primacy effect tends to dominate. I'll show you another example of that here, and I think it's coming up, right now. This is the importance of warmth. In this case, a lecturer was brought into a college seminar. A group of about 20 students were in a class reacting to they were told basically you're going to have a guest lecturer. And the guest lecturer was introduced with just a standard kind of array of curriculum vitae kind of information. The very last statement that was utilized was the following statement. People who know him consider him to be a rather cold person, industrious, critical, practical, determined. Or the statement that was read was, people who know him consider him to be a very warm person, industrious, critical, practical, and determined. After the person lectured for 30 minutes, they were then asked to rate the lecturer, the guest, on a variety of different scales. The one that was most interesting was that in terms of class participation, the class to whom he had been introduced as a rather cold person, only 32% of the students in a seminar actually got their hands in the air and interacted with him at any point during the class. In the instance where he had been introduced as a very warm person, 56% of the students interacted with him during class. The net result is that what's happened there is you've heard one word which is on a hot-cold scale and 4 words which on that scale are neutral. And what's happened is a primacy effect. That is, by hearing the phrase of rather cold person, industrious, critical, practical, determined, determined is converted into rigidity. He's not just determined, he's cold, he's set in his ways. And the net result is that that one word actually ends up biasing the reception of 4 other words. So it's as if you hear 5 words in a row that make this person a very cold, rigid kind of person, not pleasant to interact with, or a very warm, flexible kind of person. So again, beware of the recency effect. It can even impact adjectives. Consider the issue of out-of-role behavior. If you go in and interview for a job, if you end up spilling coffee on yourself during the interview and cuss a blue streak, people will remember that a lot better than the fact that you were unctuous and polite and quite knowledgeable through the entirety of the interview. So that if you engage in out-of-role behavior, that's the thing that people tend to attach most of the significance to. And finally then, personal bias. Consider the role of brother, which I'm reasonably familiar with. It's a hero to the younger sister, a pest to the older sister, and a drifter to the parents. The question is, who is that person actually? And in essence, those are just different attitudes that are different perceptions of the individual, depending on the frame of reference that is reflected by the individual doing the perception. One of the more interesting things that you and I get into sometimes in person perception is stereotyping. And that is what happens is that we essentially create for ourselves a general description of a group of people and then use that to structure how we interact with people. And the net result is that, for instance, Italians are by Americans are considered the number one adjective associated with Italians is passionate. 44% of Americans associate passion with Italians. Other adjectives or phrases that are also associated are pleasure-loving and artistic, words that are part of the American stereotype of Italians. The Chinese are thought to be loyal to family ties, tradition-loving, quiet, and industrious. The primary associates there, stereotypes. For the English, Americans view them as conservative. 53% of all Americans view the English as conservative. Okay, that's the highest association to any nationality of the group that was studied in the study I'm citing from here. Sophisticated and reserved. So conservative, sophisticated, and reserved are the 3 most common associates of the American stereotype of the English. Stereotypes are okay in and of themselves. They may be based on insufficient evidence, but they do help us structure how to interact with people, and that's okay as long as they don't become prejudice. Prejudice is essentially a prejudgment that is formed either prior to examining all the data or in direct defiance of the data itself. Prejudice at its worst can become racism, which is one of the most pervasive forms of prejudice in this country. There are several sources. Personal experience is one source, and by person, what I really mean there are things like parents. One of the most obvious sources of prejudice is parents, parental training, in-home training before even getting out to meet people of various nationalities and races and so forth. That in turn can lead to and encourage discrimination in some cases. That is, that you're simply doing what dad did, doing what mom has done, in which it's a behavior that basically prevents any minority group member from attaining what majority group members have. That is, the practice of prejudice becomes essentially discrimination, and it can be a roadblock to the development of those in a minority state in any situation. Scapegoating is another thing that also results from racial prejudice particularly, although this can happen also in more general social situations where essentially it's aggression which is displaced onto those that are economically or socially or politically weaker than we are. We tend to scapegoat individuals in a kind of a discriminatory act. Institutions can also be a major source of difficulty. There has been a long, hot battle in this country for 50 years, basically, as to how we go about mixing children in education. Some have argued in favor of busing plans. Others have said that the neighborhood school is really preferable. And of course, what happens is socioeconomics is what tends to drive the neighborhoods. And so people earning common salaries tend to live together. And that, to a certain extent, tends to follow racial lines. And so you've got a very complex institutional problem with being able to try to impact and alter prejudice and racism. There are other things. There is one other institutional thing that I should also point out, and that, well, procedures for reducing prejudice, what I was going to say here will also fit here. One of the biggest difficulties is changing people's attitude when they are discriminating or prejudiced. One effective means for doing that is to put people together in a forced situation where they have to work together, and then set up the environment in such a way that it is to their benefit to actually work together. And discriminatory practices relatively quickly melt away under that kind of a condition. One of the other pressures for prejudice and racism are the media. One of the classic Academy Award-winning movies was Gone with the Wind, which was taped way back in the 1930s. The first black ever to win an Academy Award played a maid in that movie, and she was a very classic step-and-fetch-it, hustling black maid in the 1860s in the U.S. That movie, having been as popular as it was and revised as many times as it has been, is with us now 75 years later, depicting a stereotype that existed 130 years ago in this country. And with the stability of media, you know, once it's filmed, it's there forever. And it represents a kind of a constant reminder of a state that we have moved well past in this country. But the media themselves become a kind of an anchor point of what the beliefs and practices are in the country at each of a variety of steps. And they can actually serve a retarding effect on efforts to advance the country politically, socially. Finally then, let's look at altruism and helping behavior. That's essentially offering help at a time when no benefit is actually expected in a given situation. Refers to altruism, basically. When it comes time to offer help, there turn out to be a series of decisions that have to be made. Actually, 5 of them, as it turns out. This study was originally generated out of a murder that occurred in 1964 in New York. A lady named Kitty Genovese was beaten to death. She was attacked 3 separate times in back of an apartment which was 8 or 10 stories high and had 100 or so windows that actually overlooked the area where she was beaten up and ultimately killed. She was crying for help. It was a early Sunday morning, and nobody called. And it turned out there were almost 40 people. There were 38 people who eventually watched some part of that 3-hour attack and ultimate murder. 3 different times the lady was attacked and eventually beaten to death. nobody ever called the police. And social psychologists got interested in wondering how on earth that could have happened. And it led to a very interesting series of studies. And what they've been able to demonstrate is that there are actually 5 different types of decisions that have to be made before the decision to offer help is actually offered. The first thing you have to do is to notice the situation. The easiest way not to get involved is don't notice it or overlook the signals that are there. The second thing you have to do is to interpret it as an emergency. Was that a scream or a laugh? Was that a gunshot or a backfire? Third thing you have to do is to assume responsibility, and here's where Kitty Genovese apparently met her demise. The kind of research that was done to investigate this involved isolating people in a room with a microphone. And in essence, when subjects were brought in to participate in this study, it was suggested that you're going to participate in a discussion of problems in entering college. You're going to be given as long as you need to describe the biggest problem that you've had in entering college. And we will let you, because these are going to be fairly personal discussions, what we're going to do is put you in a room isolated with a microphone and let you talk without having to deal eye-to-eye contact with everybody else in the room. Each person who was brought in was actually tested alone, but the impression was given that they were with 1, 3, or 5 other people in the experimental situation. Actually, all of the other subjects were recordings, so that the recordings were simply played when necessary. You were drawn, and it turned out you went first, so you spoke your line about what your biggest problem was, and then each other person, however many others there were in the group, each other tape recording was played. So you now thought you were part of one of 2 or one of 4, or one of 6 people. Area 2 starts, the second phase starts. Now what we're going to ask you to do is to talk at least briefly about what you're trying to do to correct your problem. What strategies have you developed to try and overcome this problem? And what happened then is you just get launched into describing what you're doing about terminal nail biting, and all of a sudden the person who has previously indicated that they have a problem with epilepsy, that was the problem they described, that they'd had a couple of seizures in class, it was very personally embarrassing, it was awkward for the teacher, awkward for the students, and so forth. That was the problem. He starts having an attack. And you hear some fumbling, and there's some groaning, and then there's some pleas for help, and then there's a little more fumbling and groaning, and eventually there's one last large, please get me help, and then there's a thud and total silence. And the question is, the dependent variable was, would the subject in that situation actually get up and go over to get help for the person that had had the epileptic seizure on tape? Well, the results were kind of discouraging, but eye-opening. The larger the participants thought the group that they were part of, the lower the likelihood that they would actually go get help. That process is now identified as diffusion of responsibility, and it turns out to be isolated only to situations where you are in fact alone. If you can see other people, the curve is exactly the reverse. That is, when you're with a large number of other people with whom you can interact and see, the odds that you'll get help go up as the size of the group increases. And the net result then is that diffusion of responsibility occurred in the Kitty Genovese incident in that apartment house in New York because none of the other people could see each other. Nobody could see anybody else, and so there was no interaction, and thus the odds dropped significantly that anybody would go to get help for her. The fourth thing that you have to do is to identify the correct form of assistance, and then finally you also have to actually implement the decision itself. When people are similar to you, when they're of the same general social class, that's when help is most likely to be offered. There was a fascinating study done on the freeways in Los Angeles. They kind of picked up on this a little bit, the 5 decisions that have to be made. What they did was to put a sedan there, just a regular, common, everyday car with a flat tire, and a woman in a business suit standing there kind of winding her watch, obviously very well dressed, not set up to be able to change a car tire, which was obviously what was needed. And they simply tallied a little less than 1% of 4,000 cars passing actually stopped and offered to help. Then what they did was to put a second sedan, similar model, about a quarter mile earlier up the highway with another woman standing there, also dressed professionally, with somebody there actually helping the tire. The deck is up, the trunk has been opened, the tire is out leaning against the car has been jacked up, and the person is there acting as if they're actually taking the nuts off the tire. So most of what's necessary has been modeled. And you've got about a quarter mile in which to decide, and what happened was it essentially doubled the number of people who would actually stop to model to help change the tire. The point being that about 4 out of the 5 decisions had, the help had been modeled. It was clearly an emergency and had been modeled as such about a quarter mile earlier. And that gave people enough time to think that, gee, I could have done that. Oh, there's somebody, and I'll pull in and help. And that's exactly what happened. Now, as we get into looking at what psychology is not, Donald Hebb, a psychologist from Canada, as president of the American Psychological Association one time said, psychology is not clinical psychology. It's not physiological psychology. It is not social, nor comparative, nor developmental, nor human experimental psychology. It is something more comprising all of those lines of approach to the central mystery. And in essence, what he was talking about is, as a senior research psychologist, is what psychology actually is. You will remember the continuum of sciences that I started out with way back at the beginning of the semester, in which I suggested basically that we could put psychology on this continuum and anchor it somewhere in the middle. It may or may not surprise you to learn that both Hebb and B.F. Skinner end up arguing that psychology is part of biology. I continue with Hebb's quote, in which he said, "Psychology is a biological science. Before you clinical and social and vocational guidance types get up and leave, hear me a little further. I think anyone will agree, including the monkey trainer, the rat brain plumber, and those who write down baby talk, that the urgent psychological problems are social and clinical. These are the big ones, on which more light is needed to promote human welfare. These are the problems of prejudice and social conflict, at worst war, and the problems of mental disorder, neurosis and psychosis. Knowing more about the rat and pigeon is, I personally am sure, a step toward understanding humans. Maybe for practical purposes it's a necessary step, but it's peripheral. It's a means, not an end. Memory, however studied, is an essential component of behavior, but one component only. There is a larger picture to take account of, and its social and clinical implications are vital." He was joined in that assertion by no less a psychologist than B.F. Skinner, who said, and I quote again directly, "I must begin by saying what I take a science of behavior to be. It is, I assume, part of biology." Now, those are two preeminent experimental psychologists essentially arguing that ultimately psychology and the answers in our discipline are going to be reduced to biological explanations. And they're basically arguing that the array of content areas that we talk about is going to be done ultimately in terms of biology. The point being that the more complex problems of how we then interact with each other remain as clinical problems. And even two great psychologists such as Donald Hebb and B.F. Skinner are as one in that particular perspective. Now, in essence, before we quit, having berated you with the views of both B.F. Skinner and Donald Hebb, I want to suggest that the bottom line lessons of both of these two people is that what we need to do is to acknowledge biology, but study behavior. And with that in mind then, let me also go back and remind you of somebody else whose work I talked about way back at the beginning, and that is the work of Thomas Kuhn. You will remember that Kuhn was arguing that psychology is in what he called a pre-paradigmatic state, pre-paradigm. What he means by that basically is that in terms of the 4 rules of how science is conducted, or what constitutes a science, the one that we're missing in psychology still is an overarching organizing principle that kind of ties everything together. And his basic idea is to suggest that what we don't yet have is an all-encompassing theory, and the result is the discipline comes across as a little bit scattered. It's about a ½ an inch deep and very, very wide at this point, because we don't yet have that overarching organizing scheme. But Kuhn goes on to point out that the discipline as such is very, very young. The subject matter is only about 120 years old. Physics, on the other hand, has been around for 400 or 500 years. No great surprise, they might have made more progress than psychologists have. I'm going to block on his name. There is an astronomer now deceased at Cornell University. Anybody come up with his name?
Carl Sagan.
Thank you. Carl Sagan, who wrote a book many books. In one of his books, he indicated that there are more two-neuron, interneuron connections in the average human brain than there are molecules in the universe, which begins to give you some semblance of the complexity of what we're dealing with by way of psychological phenomena. And the idea that it may take us a while to bring these up or discover everything we're talking about here is perhaps, or should not perhaps, be too surprising for you. There have been a lot of papers written down through the years, things entitled The Crisis of Confidence in Social Psychology. George Albee, a later president of the American Psychological Association, wrote about the uncertain future of clinical psychology. And those papers regarding worry have shown up off and on over the last quarter century or so. And basically what they're fretting about collectively is exactly what Kuhn identified. And that is the fact that we don't yet have a single overarching theory of organization. So there is a lot of work yet to do. And the question then is, what is the future of psychology for you? And the answer is that there are several ways to answer this question. One is, what course next? You have now essentially completed, we're 14 minutes from completing, the introduction to psychology. We offer about 50 or 55 courses at the undergraduate level in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Houston, as do many undergraduate schools around the country. The University of Houston offers some 2,200 undergraduate courses, and you're going to take 42 of those and call yourself an expert in psychology or business administration or engineering or something. In that context, what I would like to do is to offer you a couple of different pieces of information. One is that I think what you ought to do is to finish your core courses first. That is, assuming as a 1300 course you're taking this early in your career. What I would do is not squander many electives now. I would finish the core courses, but shop widely. Okay? We've got about 2,200 courses offered at the undergraduate level, many of which have introductory courses in their content area. Use the distribution requirements that you're forced to complete, to shop around and see what's necessary, see what you like. You will remember I said earlier in the semester I didn't take a psychology course until I was a junior, and it was actually because of interest tests that I did that originally. But if you shop widely, you will perhaps overlap with these kind of courses that may catch your fancy even more than whatever you're majoring in now. Secondly, what I would then do is to complete your major courses. Once you've done the core courses, freshman and sophomore years, now complete the major courses. Make it a goal to try and have your major courses essentially done by the end of your junior year. And the net result is then that you come rolling into your senior year with nothing but electives left, which I think is a desirable state for several reasons. First of all, what it means is that you are then able to engage in a year-long honors course of some sort. You could do an honors thesis of some sort as one possibility. Another is that you could involve yourself with a faculty member in individual research in one form or another and be participating in his or her research for a year. That's the kind of person out of whom you will get a very good and strong and impactful letter of recommendation. Okay? If somebody's, I mean, any of us can go get Juan or Juanita is an excellent person kind of letters. The ones that really are going to impact graduate school or your first employer are the ones that don't just say you're a wonderful person, which we all are, of course, but rather ones that target specifically the activities that they know you can do. And they learn that by watching you in a research project as one possibility. Another advantage is that what this means is that you are then able to take the GRE, for instance, if you're going into a liberal arts PhD, you can take that test early enough so that if you mess it up, you've got time to recycle and do it again during your senior year before graduate school deadlines pass. You're ready for the MCAT, the LSAT, the business exam, whichever happens to be the specialty exam in your area. If you've done your major and your core courses first, you're then better prepared to use your senior year to maximize, for instance, getting a job, which can be very beneficial. That is to take the time to employ yourself or be employed in the area that is that which you're most interested in. That also enriches your vita. The what is it? Career Planning and Placement Center in the Student Services building on campus here has a booklet that they give out each year for free that runs about 75 or 80 or 100 pages showing you how to do a vita, making a general series of comments like what I'm making in terms of how to organize an undergraduate career and so forth. And I think you will find those comments to be particularly helpful in describing how to go about maximizing your hours here, the 120 or 25 or 30 hours that you complete as part of your undergraduate major. So let's go back to the list here and look at what we're going to do into the new millennium here. In terms of the future of psychology, for you, first of all, we can look at what course is next. And in essence, what I'm going to argue is that you back off from psychology now because you've tried that, and go look at some other courses. Try sociology, try economics, try political science, and farm around, shop around in the social sciences. Do the same thing in the natural sciences. If you're required to take a course or two in there, if you're getting a bachelor's degree, shop there too. Try geology, try biology, try several of them as your course load permits, and shop around. Then select your core courses your major, and push through as much of that as you can. And you will find that most departments are organized like ours is. There are the general courses, one of which you've now completed. There are the very specific courses that are typically serving as kind of a second level introduction to special areas. And then we have the largest number of highly specialized courses. We did human memory. We had a whole section of the course here, a chapter or two dedicated to human memory. We offer courses that deal just with short-term memory as one possibility at the undergraduate level. So the topics that we've covered very shallowly in this course are actually expanded into full semester-long treatments of a wide variety of different topics. And you can't do all of them, but you can at least pick a general approach in terms of whether you want to do a run of courses in developmental or cognitive psychology or any of the several other options we have, for instance, in testing and industrial organizational psychology and so forth. So most departments are organized that way. General courses, specialized introductory courses, and then the much larger detailed courses that kind of get to the nitty-gritty of what any given discipline is based on. Do not specialize too early. People walk around, I'm a sophomore and I haven't picked a major yet. Great. That's not a problem. There's going to be plenty of time to be whoever you ultimately are, but the longer you can go preserving your options, the better. The only two disciplines where you really have to make a decision early are business administration and engineering. And the reason there is, and to a certain extent in the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, the reason is that the courses are stacked. And the problem is that if you don't start early, you're going to bump the delay. You're going to delay the graduation time, because if you don't get those sequences started, you're not going to have enough time to get through all of the stacked courses that are part of that kind of expanding curriculum that they have. But with those few exceptions, you can specialize in a wide variety of the liberal arts and not actually make that decision until your sophomore year or even early in your junior year. I think I described back in the semester that, in fact, when I screwed up in a physics course during my sophomore year, I took a series of interest tests and decided on pursuing general science and medicine. And it wasn't actually until I ran into organic chemistry, or organic chemistry ran over me, that I decided that maybe I wasn't really prepared for medicine. And I didn't actually become a psych major until January of my senior year. Now, it was just blind luck that happened to me. But as I looked back on my career, I saw that it would have been possible to organize the courses in such a way that I would have had that ability until very late in my undergraduate career before actually making a decision. So I would argue that you not specialize too early and broadly educate yourself. Regardless of your undergraduate plans, if your ultimate plans, if they include a psychology course, plan to take statistics. Methods and statistics are vital to the way in which we practice psychology, and you need to get that course. They are now required courses. Knock them out fairly early if you're going to get into the general area. Let's look at jobs with a bachelor's degree that are possible. I want to go back and remind you of some data that we looked at way back at the beginning of the semester. Do you remember this curve? It's plotted slightly differently now, but here I show you the what psychologists call themselves and how we are spread out as disciplinarians. Clearly, clinical community is the biggest part of our discipline, but there are some other healthy-sized areas of research interest and activity. Secondly, where do we work? And I will remind you again that it looks like this, where treatment is the largest single block. And this graph is now several years old because it's been a while since they did a general survey, and I would suspect that the treatment area is probably now up over 50% in all likelihood. And thirdly, then, what do we do? And this is a cross-section of nobody in particular, but collectively, a large number of us are involved in faculty, research, teaching activities. The largest single group is in direct human services, and the rest are in a much more limited area in terms of what they actually are participating in. For society, there's a broader kind of series of answers that I can give here. One of the areas that I would cite for you is what are the jobs for somebody with a bachelor's degree in psychology? And there turn out to be quite an array of types of work available. Again, keeping in mind that what you've got now is a bachelor's degree. Some people make the unfortunate choice or decision that an undergraduate education is a training for work or a job. It isn't. It isn't designed that way. It isn't meant to be. A good undergraduate education basically teaches you to think, and that's all. But it does also offer you flexibility, the more so if you've got a good set of courses that you've selected for yourself. Okay? If you've got a balanced set of courses, you are then adaptable, and that's key in today's world. But you could go into personnel work, hiring or firing people. You could do assessment or interviewing with a bachelor's degree. Go into public relations, things like advertising, front office personnel work, sales jobs in real estate, book companies, book company travelers, any kind of field that doesn't require extensive training, even something like real estate, you could move into from psychology. You could go into child or daycare centers, babysitting, home baby management kind of work, teaching, high school, elementary school. Psychology is the most popular non-required elective in high school nationally, and they need teachers. You go into further education. It's an excellent preparation for professional school, whether it's law or medicine or even education, as we've talked about, even social work. Or you could go on into psychology. Now, if I were going to look at psychology, society, and ask what I think psychology has contributed to society, there are several things that I would cite. Probably number one is psychotherapy. As a form of professional helping relationship, I think that is perhaps the most valuable thing that society has actually contributed. But there are a number of others that I could also point out. Testing. We do a better job of matching people and their interests to jobs that they're good at than any other country in the world because of the amount of testing that we do. And even though you may not like your memories of Stanford or California or Iowa tests, the interest tests that are part of that general genre can be very helpful in placing you where you properly ought to be. Advertising is an application of psychological principle, not only in terms of attention getting, principles of contrast and perception. All of that is wrapped up in advertising. Childcare, developmental psychology and the principles that apply there. Even things like learning skills and the text that you've used in this course with computer-assisted instruction are really part of what psychology has contributed to society. Now, in terms of the future for psychology, I'm going to offer you 3 books as recommended reading. One is a book by B.F. Skinner called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, in which what he does is to apply the principles of psychology in an ideal society. It was a very controversial book when it came out, but all he was really doing was saying that punishment suppresses behavior and it doesn't work. Rewarding behavior that you do want is a more effective way to alter it. A very controversial but quite thought-provoking book. A second book was a book by Alvin Toffler called Future Shock, in which he envisioned a world that would ultimately move ever more away from the production of material goods and toward developing service industries. And the final one that I would recommend is to go back to the 1969 summary of the American Psychological Convention and read that book called Psychology and the Problems of Society. It dealt with psychology and the social change process, urban problems, the challenge of early learning, minority groups, and the reduction of violence. 33 years later, that list is basically unchanged. It's still part of what we need to worry about. So in conclusion, basically what I would suggest is that the discipline is young, the task is big, and the job is scarcely begun. Come join us. It's quite a ride.